Okay, folks, welcome back to what can only be described as a barren, empty apartment. As some of you may know, I'm away from the studio. I'm here with my family visiting for the holidays, so I thought it might be fun, rather than doing like a really formal lesson or a formal review, let's just do a mic tier list. I haven't seen a mic tier list on the internet yet. I'll be the first, maybe. Also, check this out. I got a B cam. It's an old crappy camera from 2011, but I got a B cam. Back to A cam. So it's important to note that just like many things on a tier list, microphones are not like an end-all be-all thing, right? They're color palettes you can use. And honestly, even though this is really bad for our gear acquisition syndrome, the more you have, the more color palettes you have to choose from, the more your mix is going to thank you. So this is just a bit of fun, right? Please don't take this too seriously. If I put a mic that you like way down on the tier list, know that there's still probably a place for it in any studio. Even if I personally don't like that mic, on the right mix, I might end up using that mic. Also, to clarify, this is a vocal microphone tier list. There are some microphones on this list that could very well be in S tier if this was a generalist microphone tier list. In order to be a little bit more specific, and I think to give myself a little bit more guidance on where I'm putting these microphones, this is specifically for vocals. That said, let's go ahead and jump right into it after we hear a word from our sponsor. Our sponsor is, as always, DistroKid. Throughout this whole entire month, we're talking about how DistroKid can do so much more for you than just publish your music on all the major platforms as well as a bunch of other ones. We've talked about how you can make an NFT with DistroKid. We've talked about how you can donate to charity with DistroKid. Now we're specifically going to talk about Tidal, which is a streaming service many of you may use. It's for high fidelity streaming. It's called Tidal Artists Direct Payouts. It's a pretty simple concept. Basically, every time that you are the most listened to artist for a specific listener, you actually get 10% of their Tidal subscription fee. Keep in mind, this is not replacing regular streaming revenue, which again, with DistroKid, you get 100% of your streaming revenue for $20 a year, depending on the plan. But this is in addition to it. It's just yet another way that you can monetize your music through DistroKid. And to go back to the regular spiel, I always say this, if you're going to publish your music, in all likelihood, you're going to be using DistroKid anyway. So there's all this infrastructure in place to further monetize your art through NFTs, through this payout program through Tidal, but it is by far the best way to earn all of your revenue in the first place. It's important to note though, for this Tidal artist payout program, you need to specifically opt into it using a link I'll provide in the description down below. There also will be a link there if you would like to use that and get a discount to sign up for DistroKid. Also helps me out and supports the channel quite a lot. Let's go do the tier list. Don't get mad at me. Some of you are going to get mad at me. It's all right. Okay, so I think the easiest way to do this is to kind of establish some boundaries. So I'm going to pick an S tier, I'm going to pick an F tier, and I'm going to pick like a C tier, and we can go from there. So the first thing I'm going to do is pick an S tier, and I think it's going to be kind of hard to argue this. I think everyone can probably agree on this. I'm going to take the U87 and put it in S tier. It's important to remember that on this list, I am factoring in price. I've seen a lot of tier lists similar to this that they don't factor in price, and I just don't think that's fair. Even with this crazy 3,000 whatever price range that the U87 is in, I still think it deserves S tier. It's a legendary mic. You've all heard it on one of your favorite recordings, I'm sure. And it's the gold standard and has been the gold standard for many, many years. It's kind of like what all other microphones are compared to in a weird way, at least for condensers. So U87, S tier, I don't think there's going to be too much controversy with that. In F tier, I'm putting the Samson C01. Now let me explain. Now this mic is not necessarily a horrible mic at face value. My kitten climbed in my lap, it's fine. She might attack my leg, I might scream in pain. The problem with the Samson C01 in my experience, at least with the microphone I tried, the self noise was so high if you were to add any sort of post-processing to it, specifically with a kind of an aggressive amount of compression or maybe a high shelf, that noise becomes so much more apparent. Almost, any intimate, quiet mix, that self noise, that hiss is just too much to work with in my opinion. Now, in C tier, to round off the boundaries here, definitely a controversial opinion, definitely going to hear about this. SM7B I'm putting in C tier. Again, Not because it's a bad microphone, but because I think it's a little bit overhyped for what it is. First off, I think people just see this in a podcasting scenario and assume it's the best one to get, not knowing it's a relatively dark microphone and it takes more than your beginner podcaster in order to run this thing. You don't need a cloud lifter. You don't need a fed head. I've repeated that. I've made a whole video about it. I've made multiple sections of multiple videos about it. But in order to get the most out of this thing without a cloud lifter or a fed head, you need to know a little bit about post-processing. With that being said, personally, I also think it's a little overly dark for my tastes. This darkness for me doesn't suit my voice. I think it makes it a little bit muddy. I have enough low mid-range in my voice. I don't need any more. It is great for sibilance control though, unarguably one of the best mics I've heard for controlling sibilance. Alright, so in S tier, I'm putting the Electro Voice RE20. Maybe I'm a little bit biased. I'm currently speaking into it. It's my main microphone I use, but if you need an Exhibit Y, as I've mentioned before, go listen to the basement sessions of Radiohead in Rainbows. I'll link it. But this microphone has I think my cat's about to jump on the camera. You want to say hi? But this microphone to me has a much more even distribution of frequencies than the SM7B, which is obviously its most frequent comparison. To me, it reaches lower into the low end actually, and reaches higher into the high end, has much more extension, and it does it very flat, and it does it in a really nice, sweet way. And on top of that, it's easier to power than the SM7B. Easier to power than the SM7B, yes. And it also takes the post-processing a little bit easier. I find a lot of people when they're mixing with the SM7B, they like to add a lot of high shelf in order to bring the brightness back into a mix. Well, you don't necessarily have to do that as much with the RE20, and therefore you might get less of a hiss. I just also prefer the tone. I think it can be sweeter when it wants to be sweeter. I think it can be warmer when it wants to be warmer. And it can certainly be brighter when it wants to be brighter. Okay, let's talk about the TLM 102. Just did a review of this thing. It was kind of a controversial review. As controversial as a microphone review can be. Bly, come on. I'm going to put it in B tier for a couple reasons. First off, if you've watched my review, I actually said this is one of the best mics I've actually ever heard on the channel. But as many of you may realize, the audience here is more tailored towards the home studio, and there are some glaring issues, in my opinion, with the TLM 102 for use in a home studio. Its sensitivity is off the charts compared to what I've seen for a lot of other microphones. If you've seen the review, you definitely heard my heater. And the fact that it doesn't come with a shock mount means you need to pay a premium in order to make this thing perform optimally. Not to mention that shock mount is expensive. So while the TLM 102 is an extraordinarily good sounding microphone, and if it didn't have these weaknesses, I would certainly put it a lot higher, these weaknesses pull it back down just a little bit. So let's talk about the AKG C214 next. I'm putting this thing in A tier for a couple reasons. The number one reason, honestly, is for a microphone that boosts high-end frequencies. I have not heard a microphone do it as eloquently as this does, especially in its price range. It certainly boosts a lot of high-end. It's a very sparkly microphone, but it somehow does this without being sibilant at all. Whoa, hey. All right, well, thank you, Bly. It's a beast of a vocal microphone when it comes to having a nice, bright mix that cuts through all the noise and sits on top of everything really well, really eloquently. Plus, the build quality on this thing is amazing. So joining the TLM 102 in B tier, I'm going to put the Rode NT1A. The Rode NT1A is an absolutely brilliant microphone that comes with everything you're going to need in a home studio microphone. Low self-noise. Well, you know, maybe not everything you'll need in a home studio setup, because it could be better at rejecting background noise. And personally speaking, all that high-end sort of adjusting that it does in the frequency response leaves it, to me, just a little bit glassy. To me, the AKG C214 is an example of a microphone that handles high-end much more eloquently than the Rode NT1A does. And on that note, why don't we talk about the Rode NT1? To me, this is just a grade above the NT1A. Kind of similar in sound profile, but then again, also very different. And that's because the Rode NT1 is much more of a mid-ranged focused microphone. It's going to care a lot more about both the lower and upper mid-range, and it also is going to have a much more flat response. This makes it easier to do post-processing later. It's a little bit more honest of a microphone, and if you have a deeper voice, I tend to find that it doesn't thin it out as much. With that being said, the Rode NT1 does have problems with both room rejection and sibilance response, and this is true of the Rode NT1A. They kind of share the same faults. I think the Rode NT1A, with its more high-end response, is just a little bit thinner on my voice and on voices that I've worked with in the past. Let's talk about the AKG P420. I'm going to put it in D tier. And this is a little bit harder to quantify for me because this is not a bad microphone by any means. I know a lot of people that like this microphone, but for me, it shares some of the same problems of the NT1 without the benefits of the NT1. To me, it's a little bit thin sounding. It also has a higher self noise than the NT1A. The NT1A has a much lower self noise, which makes that high-end response just a little bit easier to work with in post-processing. Yeah, to me, it's just a little bit thin. Not my favorite. Let's talk about the NW800, shall we? Now, obviously, all of your inclination is telling you to put it in F tier, right? And that's because it's a $20 microphone, and all of these others are at least 80 bucks. Well, remember, we're factoring in price here. For the price, the NW800 does not deserve to be in S tier. Yes, it's insanely sibilant. Yes, it has some of the worst room rejection even for a condenser I've ever heard in my life. Yes, it sounds thin. It does not sound $20 thin. It does not sound $20 sibilant. It does not sound $20 worth of sibilance. And for that reason, part of me wants to put it in C tier. Hi, Bly. But I know how upset everyone would be if I put this microphone in the same class as the SM7B. So I'm going to put it in D tier. I think if you factor in price, it certainly does not need to be in F tier. It is so much cheaper. You can buy 4 of these things for the same price as the next cheapest microphone, that being the Samson CO1. Ow. So let's talk about the Audio-Technica AT2020. I'm going to put it in C tier with the SM7B. The Audio-Technica AT2020, to me, I've said this multiple times, it's like the most dynamic sounding condenser I've ever heard. It rejects noise really, really well, and it beefs up the low end and kind of has an overly masculine response. It's great for spoken word, and it's great for rap. I said rap weird. Rap. It's great for rap and great for spoken word because of the fact that it beefs up that low end response, kind of has a podcast-like quality. And if you want a really solid, kind of aggressive masculine vocal take, to me, the AT2020 is what you need, and it's great that it's so cheap. And on that note, the AT2035 is a very similar sounding microphone. I'm going to put it in the same class, although just maybe high C tier because of the fact that it comes with some more bells and whistles and a nice shock mount. All right, let's talk about the AKG C414. This is one of my favorite mics, and I would be remiss if I didn't put it in S tier. I'm going to put it here, though, if that makes any sense. This is the most S tier. This is the least S tier. And that is because the AKG C214 has yet to sound bad on anything I've ever used it on. It is everything that the AKG C214 is and more. It's incredibly, incredibly versatile. This could be a tier list for drum mics. This could be a tier list for guitar cab mics. This could be a tier list for anything. I'd put it in S tier. Sounds so good. It's super versatile. I think it has like, what, 8 polar patterns? It's just amazing, and I don't even know why. Really insightful commentary there, Ricky. All right, let's talk about the MD441, which is the only microphone on this list that has not been featured on the channel. I actually put this on the list because I was watching some videos last night. It's going in A tier, by the way, and decided to throw it in because I think it has an extremely unique vocal response that honestly none of the other mics on this list actually have. It's super warm and super vintage sounding. And if you need proof of that, I'll link it down in the description. Go listen to this live session that Hosier did. If you want another example, and you're kind of into the pop realm, go listen to the most recent NPR Tiny Desk that Olivia Rodrigo did. It's super sweet sounding. It's definitely not overly bright, definitely warm, definitely dark, definitely has a more vintage vibe to it. I love the aesthetic, but everything that goes through it just sounds so smooth. It's almost like you put it through a tape machine. It's like a built-in tape machine and a built-in like vintage mic pre inside of a microphone. Love it. I've also worked with it a number of times in the studio I used to be at. Brilliant. All right, let's talk about the LCT 440. I am going to put it in A tier. It's a very good microphone, and it shares a lot of sonic characteristics with the AKG C214. Love, you can't attack anything on the screen. It's on the screen. It doesn't exist in real life, just like my career on YouTube. So the AKG C214 and the Lewitt LCT 440 Pure have a very similar sonic characteristic. They handle high-end extremely well, but what I love about Lewitt doesn't try and hide behind this vintage aesthetic and sort of like vintage pedigree that a lot of other microphones hide behind. Like with Rode, you know the Rode is based off of the U87 if you just look at it. The circuitry is and the aesthetics are. But if you look at the Lewitt is its own thing. I love the green. I love the black. Yes, I just love how they're being innovative both in like a modern sound and also modern aesthetics. Not to mention, if you guys have seen that blind producers test that we did where we had 3 blind producers guess their favorite microphone and also try and guess which one it was, the Lewitt was the only one we all got right, and we all rated the Lewitt the highest. Hard to argue with those results. All right, let's talk about the Aston Spirit. Kind of a controversial opinion. I'm going to put it in C tier. No, I'm going to put it in B tier. I'm going to put it in low B tier. It's a good mic. It's definitely innovating in a lot of ways with the built-in pop filter, built-in shock mount. But to me, its vocal response, it's one of these mics that are tailoring the vocal response to a more high-end sound. And to me, it's just a little bit thin, a little bit too bright for my taste. When I see this mic, I think vintage and I think more of a warm sound. But, you know, honestly, little thin. I wanted to like it more than I did. The way it like attaches itself to a mic stand is a little bit awkward. We always had to like put it at an angle or put it at a horizontal like positioning because it doesn't accept a traditional shock mount. A little bit unwieldy to work with. Not my favorite. All right, so this is gonna get feisty. If this were just a microphone generalist tier list, the SM57 would go in S tier. It's hard to argue that for me. Everyone owns an SM57. It's one of the first mics everyone gets, and it's a mic everyone keeps for their entire lifespan. As I've said many times, it will outlive you and it will outlive your musical career. But we're talking about vocal mics. And if we're talking about vocal mics, I would put it at like a high C tier. The SM57 for me has a lot of benefits over the SM7B, including being easier to power, being more flexible, being used on more instruments, also having that upper presence that we can EQ down to sound a lot like an SM7B. But for a vocal mic specifically, it's really solid, but there are others that do it better. It's a great all-rounder, but for a vocal mic, I would put it in mid-tier. And on that note, we all know that the SM58 is basically the exact same thing as the SM57 with a pop shield, making it better for vocals. So it should go in like low B tier. Yeah. All right. That's a relatively even sort of bell curve, I would say. In general, none of these mics are horrible. The only one I probably wouldn't use is the Samson. For the self-noise reason, not because it sounds particularly bad. Yeah, I think this is a well-rounded list. The S-tier mics are definitely all the mics I would prefer to own out of all of these. And with that, because my laptop battery is about to die, we're going to wrap up the tier list and go to the outro.